It started with a mistake so small it should have been meaningless. A single cracked compass on a fog-drenched morning in 1943. But that fracture, barely visible to the naked eye, set off a chain of events that would lead to one of the most devastating ambushes of the entire Second World War. Not because of luck, not even because of skill, but because chaos, for once, sided with the underdog. Picture this: Eastern Front, a blizzard so thick you can barely tell snow from sky. A German reconnaissance unit, cut off from radio contact, is trying to regroup with the rest of the 3rd Panzer Division. They're exhausted, hungry, and one wrong move could put them right into the hands of the Red Army. The lead officer, Oberleutnant Franz Müller, checks his compass to guide the convoy east, except it isn't pointing east. The glass face is cracked. The magnetic needle inside vibrates erratically. No one notices. They keep moving. Hours later, when the storm clears, Müller realizes his convoy has been moving north, directly into enemy territory. What should have been a quiet regrouping becomes a silent trespass into a death trap. But here's the twist. It wasn't the Germans who would pay the price for the broken compass. It was the Soviets, because Müller's mistake would accidentally place his men in the perfect position to discover one of the largest Soviet ambush formations of the war and turn it completely against them. The forest around them was quiet. Too quiet, Müller thought, the kind of silence that doesn't belong in war. His men were low on supplies and fuel. They set up camp near a river bend, unaware that only a few kilometers away, the Soviets were positioning over 20,000 troops in a crescent formation. Their plan was to lure the main German column into that curve, trap it, and annihilate it with artillery fire. But by the time the Red Army finished positioning, Müller's lost unit was already in their rear flank, watching. At dawn, one of Müller's scouts saw movement through his binoculars. Hundreds of Soviet trucks, camouflaged under nets, hidden behind the ridge. He thought he was hallucinating. They had no idea they'd stumbled behind enemy lines. The broken compass had done what no German general could have ever dared attempt: place a small recon team directly inside a Soviet ambush zone before it was triggered. What Müller did next is what turned a random accident into one of the most cunning military reversals in modern history. He knew they couldn't fight 20,000 men. But he also knew the main German division, still marching south, was walking straight into this Soviet trap. If they didn't act, thousands of their own would die. They had one radio left, but its range was limited. The storm had damaged the antenna. Müller tried to transmit coordinates anyway, static. He could only reach within a few kilometers. Not enough. So he decided to use the one thing the Soviets couldn't anticipate: their own trap. He ordered his men to stay hidden and observe. Through the night, they mapped Soviet movements, marking artillery positions and trench lines. When the Soviet commander gave the order to begin the ambush at dawn, Müller's men didn't retreat. They fired a single flare. A flare, the Soviets thought, came from their own spotters. It signaled the Red artillery to open fire on their own advancing columns, who had changed position overnight due to the weather. The first shells landed on Soviet infantry. Confusion spread instantly. Radios crackled. Officers screamed. The fog made it worse. Nobody could see who they were shooting at. And from the north, Müller's men, now completely surrounded by chaos, began firing tracer rounds in different directions to make it look like a massive counterattack was coming from the forest. Panic turned the Soviet formation into a storm of friendly fire and retreating vehicles. By the time the German 3rd Panzer Division arrived hours later, expecting to be ambushed, they found the battlefield already burning, Soviet trucks overturned, artillery abandoned, and bodies scattered across snow that looked more like ash. The Red Army had destroyed itself, and it all started with one broken compass in a soldier's coat pocket. Now here's where this story gets almost unbelievable. Intelligence reports after the war confirmed that the Soviets had spent weeks preparing that ambush. They had built fake roads, repositioned supply lines, even coordinated decoy radio chatter to lure the Germans in. Everything was perfect, except for a single, random mechanical failure that turned their plan upside down. But the question historians still argue over is this: was it really random? Because the recovered compass, later stored in a Berlin archive, didn't just have a cracked glass. Its magnet had been demagnetized, likely by prolonged exposure to a high-voltage radio transmitter. And at the time, Muller's unit had been stationed near a destroyed Soviet communication truck just days before the incident. It's possible the compass was accidentally magnetized or deliberately tampered with. No one knows. But it's one of those strange cases where human error, luck, and timing created a perfect storm of consequences. What makes this story even more haunting is what happened to Muller himself. Despite his role in saving thousands of men, his report on the ambush was classified. Commanders didn't want to admit that a German victory came from a navigational mistake. They rebranded it as a strategic preemptive strike based on superior intelligence. Muller and his unit were given medals, but forbidden from speaking about how they'd actually found the Soviet forces. For years after the war, even among his comrades, Muller's story was dismissed as exaggeration. It wasn't until decades later, when Soviet archives declassified documents from that same operation, that the truth started to surface. One Soviet general described the event in his diary as the most catastrophic case of self-destruction I ever witnessed. He never knew the Germans were behind the lines. He thought his artillerymen had misread coordinates. It was chaos from the inside out, a kind of accidental psychological warfare. But beneath all the military drama, there's a deeper idea here, a reminder that war isn't always won by the strongest or the smartest. Sometimes it's won by the ones who adapt fastest to chaos. Muller could have panicked. He could have surrendered or fled. But instead, he looked at the situation not as disaster, but as opportunity. That mindset, the ability to turn pure misfortune into leverage, is what separates survival from destruction. And it makes you wonder how many other moments in history weren't planned at all. How many victories started as mistakes? How many wars turned on the smallest, dumbest details? Like a broken piece of glass and a twitching needle in a snowstorm. The deeper you go into military history, the more you see this strange pattern, that the line between triumph and disaster isn't strategy, it's randomness. The kind that tests whether you're just following the plan or capable of rewriting it when the world refuses to make sense. Muller's broken compass didn't just save his men. It exposed something timeless about human decision-making, that sometimes, when everything goes wrong, the smartest move is to stop trying to be right. Because in that white wasteland, where every direction looked the same, Muller realized something few soldiers ever do: certainty is a trap. You can follow the perfect plan straight into hell, or stumble blindly into victory. What matters is not knowing where you are, but how you react when you realize you're lost. And that, ironically, might be why the greatest ambush in World War II history didn't belong to those who planned it, but to those who got lost inside it. When the smoke cleared that morning, the battlefield didn't look like victory, it looked like the end of the world. The forest was mangled, the snow blackened, the air thick with the stench of fuel and blood. Muller's men stepped cautiously from their positions, rifles raised, scanning for movement. There was none. Only silence broken by the crackle of distant fires and the metallic clatter of a shattered truck door swinging in the wind. They'd survived, but survival in war is never simple. The few remaining Soviet soldiers, confused and retreating, had no idea who had ambushed them. Some ran deeper into the woods, others surrendered on sight. Muller's men gathered weapons, food, and fuel, whatever they could salvage. They were still deep behind enemy lines, and every passing minute meant the Soviets could reorganize and strike back. Yet as they searched the wreckage, one of the younger soldiers noticed something strange. A radio still intact, softly hissing static. They brought it to Muller. He listened. Through the static, faint voices. Russian. Command chatter. The Soviets thought the Germans had launched a massive, coordinated counteroffensive, far larger than reality. They were pulling back their entire flank to regroup. In a single night, an entire Soviet sector had gone from predator to prey. Muller understood what this meant. They weren't just lucky, they had information. Information that could shift the entire front. But they couldn't risk transmitting from their current position. Soviet direction finders would lock onto them instantly. So he made another impossible decision. They would march deeper, through the same line of retreating Soviet forces, to reach a ridge where they could make contact safely. It was madness. But the same madness that had gotten them here might just keep them alive. That march became legend within the few who lived to tell it. 30 men moving silently through enemy chaos, past burning trucks and frozen bodies, using the confusion to mask their movement. Every few hours they'd stop, listening to artillery in the distance, watching columns of Soviet vehicles rolling in the wrong direction. Mueller knew the illusion couldn't last forever, so he devised another plan, something that would make their small force seem far larger than it was. He ordered his men to scatter, captured Soviet helmets and rifles along the road, stage fallen Germans using abandoned uniforms, and leave behind makeshift mine markers. From above, to any reconnaissance aircraft, it would look like a major German defensive stand. It worked. The Soviets halted their pursuit, diverting forces to flank what they believed was a heavily fortified position. All the while, Mueller's team kept slipping north, invisible ghosts in the storm they had unleashed. 3 days later, after surviving on scavenged food and melted snow, they reached the ridge. From there, they could finally reach command. The message Mueller sent was short, almost clinical. Enemy formation self-destroyed due to misfire. Sector compromised. Proceeding with observation. No mention of the compass. No mention of the truth. Within hours, German High Command redirected its armored columns, exploiting the sudden Soviet withdrawal. By the time Stalin's generals realized what had happened, the entire balance of the front had shifted by 50 kilometers. But in war, glory has a strange way of punishing those who actually earn it. When Mueller returned, his superior officers congratulated him for his quote, brilliant tactical intuition. They asked for his report, his strategy, his reasoning. He told them the truth, the compass, the storm, the confusion. Their faces froze. They didn't want an accident. They wanted a plan they could write about, a hero they could control, so they rewrote it. Officially, the operation was logged as a reconnaissance in-depth assault, initiated by Mueller's foresight. The broken compass never appeared in any record, and yet Mueller kept it. The same cracked device, its glass fogged, its needle trembling. He carried it for the rest of the war. Some said he considered it lucky, others said it haunted him. After the war, when he was captured by Allied forces, they found it in his pocket, wrapped in a piece of cloth. When interrogators asked why he kept it, he only said, "Because it's the only thing that ever told the truth." It's poetic, isn't it? In a war of propaganda and lies, the one honest thing was a broken tool. But here's where this story takes an even darker turn. Decades later, when military historians began digging into Soviet archives, they discovered a document dated the same week as Mueller's ambush. It described an experimental Soviet navigation device, an electromagnetic compass designed to interfere with enemy radio and navigation instruments. The project was canceled after the test field mysteriously lost contact during a blizzard. The coordinates? Less than 10 kilometers from where Mueller's unit got lost. So now the story twists again. Was Mueller's compass broken or disrupted by that experiment? Did his misdirection come from fate or from the Soviets' own weapon backfiring? The answer remains buried in fragments of files and fading memories. But what matters isn't just what happened, it's what it reveals about the nature of war itself. Because here's the thing, history tends to glorify precision. The generals who plan, the officers who execute, the armies that move like clockwork. But the reality is far messier. Wars are won not by perfect coordination, but by human improvisation in the middle of absolute chaos. The battlefield rewards those who make sense of nonsense. Mueller wasn't a genius strategist. He was just a man who refused to freeze when the world stopped making sense. He adapted faster than his fear. And that adaptability, more than training, more than orders, is what defines survival under fire. The compass didn't save him. His refusal to be paralyzed by uncertainty did. And that's what fascinates me most about this story. That something as small as a magnetic needle could expose something so vast about human psychology. We all think we're following some internal compass, our sense of direction, our certainty about what's right, what's next, what's safe. But when that compass breaks, most people panic. They stop moving. Mueller didn't. He understood that in chaos, motion itself becomes clarity. That sometimes the only way to survive being lost is to keep walking anyway. What happened next to Muller's unit would prove that point in the most brutal way imaginable. Because as they moved west, thinking they were finally out of danger, they ran straight into something far worse than the Soviets they'd escaped. The first sign of trouble wasn't the sound of gunfire. It was silence. Too heavy, too deliberate. The forest ahead seemed to breathe differently. Muller raised his hand and the column stopped. Snowflakes drifted through the branches like falling ash. His instincts told him something was wrong. The air had that stillness soldiers learn to fear, the kind that comes before something breaks. A faint crack echoed through the woods, not gunfire. Wood. A branch snapping under weight. Muller crouched, scanned the tree line. Then he saw it. A helmet glint, low and steady. Not Soviet issue, German. His heart sank. They weren't approaching friendly lines. They were walking into an area already occupied. But by whom? He signaled the men to fan out, advance slowly. When they emerged from the trees, they found the wreckage of a German supply convoy, destroyed days earlier. Trucks riddled with bullets, uniforms stripped, weapons missing. Nearby, the snow was stained dark. Whoever did this hadn't just ambushed the convoy. They'd taken their gear and vanished. Muller's men found boot tracks, but the patterns didn't match Soviet soles. These were German. That's when they realized the truth. They had stumbled into a rogue unit. Deserted soldiers turned marauders, preying on both sides of the war. Men who no longer fought for ideology or country, just survival. They had the same uniforms, the same weapons, and the same desperation. And now they knew Muller's position. Night fell fast. The temperature dropped. His men built small fires, careful to conceal the flames. But around midnight, faint voices drifted through the darkness. German, laughing, mocking. The deserters were toying with them, circling the camp unseen. Muller ordered everyone to douse the fires. They sat in darkness, rifles ready, hearts hammering. The laughter stopped. Then came a single whistle, sharp, short, a signal. Gunfire erupted from every direction. Tracers streaked through the trees. Muller's men fired back blindly, flashes of light revealing silhouettes in the fog. It was chaos, close range, brutal. These weren't disciplined soldiers. They were wolves in stolen uniforms. Muller knew they were outnumbered. So he played his last card, the same instinct that had saved them before. He shouted an order, "Fall back to the ridge!" But instead of retreating, he had his men loop behind their own position, circling the attackers. In the confusion, the deserters thought they were being surrounded by reinforcements. Panic broke their ranks. Some ran, others fired on their own. It was the Soviet ambush all over again, chaos turning in on itself. By dawn, the woods were quiet again. When it was over, half of Muller's men were dead or wounded. The rest scavenged what they could. Among the deserters' bodies, they found stolen insignias, rations, even Soviet maps marked with supply routes. Muller realized these men had been operating between both armies, intercepting communications, feeding misinformation to anyone who paid. In other words, they were ghosts of the war's gray zone, mercenaries of confusion. And in a strange way, Muller saw himself in them. Lost men, surviving by manipulation and luck. The only difference was purpose. He still believed in something, even if that belief was cracked and shaking. Like the compass in his pocket, they buried their dead in shallow snow and moved on, limping toward what they hoped was safety. But something in Muller changed that night. He stopped trusting directions altogether. Every few hours he'd stop, look at the compass, then deliberately choose the opposite path. His men thought he'd gone mad. But as they learned later, that madness saved them. Because, unbeknownst to them, Soviet forces had already re-established control of the area to their south, the very direction the compass pointed. If Muller had followed it, they would have walked straight into capture. His broken tool had lied once more and saved them again. When they finally reached a German command post days later, the sentries nearly fired on them, mistaking them for infiltrators. Filthy, frostbitten, and wearing scavenged gear, they barely looked like soldiers anymore. Muller demanded to speak with an officer. When he did, he told everything. The ambush, the deserters, the chaos. The officer nodded politely, then said, "There's no record of any Soviet forces operating in that sector." Muller stared at him in disbelief. The officer handed him a fresh map, blank where the battle had taken place. Headquarters had already erased it. The entire event was being rewritten again, buried under paperwork and propaganda. Muller realized that, in the eyes of history, his men had never existed there at all. He was ordered to return to Berlin for debriefing, but before leaving he climbed a small hill near the camp and looked back at the forest. The sky was pale gray, silent. Somewhere under that snow lay dozens of unmarked graves. His men, the deserters, even Soviets who never knew what hit them. He pulled the compass from his pocket and turned it over. The crack in the glass caught the light, like a scar that refused to heal. What haunted him most wasn't the battle or the loss. It was the realization that the compass, despite being broken, had led him to every truth he wasn't supposed to find. That every mistake had peeled back another layer of the war's illusions. And deep down, he began to suspect something he could never prove. That maybe, just maybe, being lost was the only honest state a soldier could ever be in. Because when the world demands certainty, and your compass starts lying, that's when you see who you really are. Muller had seen it. In the storm, in the ambush, in the faces of the dead. The ones who survived weren't the ones who knew where they were going. They were the ones who kept moving anyway. After the war ended, Muller disappeared. Officially, he was listed as missing in action during the final collapse of Berlin in 1945. Unofficially, there were whispers, rumors that he'd abandoned his post before the city fell, that he'd been seen wandering through the Black Forest months later, a lone man with a pack and a worn leather case. Inside that case, supposedly, was the same broken compass. For decades, that was all anyone knew. Until, in the 1970s, a farmer in southern Germany found a rusted box buried near an old logging trail. Inside were papers sealed in wax, written in a precise, almost obsessive hand. They were signed F.M. Franz Müller. The documents detailed his final days and contained maps of areas that didn't match any known military records. One note read, "Direction is only an illusion of choice. The real compass lies in error." Historians debated whether the writings were genuine, but one passage stood out, his account of a final encounter. Muller described meeting a group of displaced civilians, wandering through the same forests he'd once fought in. They were starving, lost, begging him for guidance. He wrote that he tried to use his compass again. Out of habit, the needle still twitched, uncertain. The people grew impatient, asking which way was home. Muller finally closed the compass and said, "There is no home, only where you decide to stop running." That line alone tells you the kind of man he'd become. Someone who had spent so long trapped in the machinery of war that he'd stopped believing in direction altogether. For him, the compass was no longer a tool of navigation, it was a reminder that certainty was an illusion humanity kept chasing to feel safe. When historians pieced together his writings, they realized something eerie. Every coordinate he'd drawn corresponded not to military sites, but to old battlefields where soldiers from both sides had vanished. It's as if Muller had spent his last years retracing the forgotten chaos of the war, mapping places erased from history, trying to document what official reports refused to admit. He was no longer following orders, he was following ghosts. But there's something almost symbolic about that. Because in a way, Muller's broken compass became the perfect metaphor for the world that emerged after the war. A world desperately trying to find direction again, yet constantly pulled by invisible forces of confusion, power, and ideology. Everyone thought they were heading toward peace, but in truth, the compass of civilization was just as cracked as his. Think about it. How many times since then has humanity believed it was marching toward order, only to end up circling the same mistakes under new names? Cold War, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, it's the same pattern repeating itself. Each generation convinced that this time, their compass points true. Each generation discovering too late that they're lost again, only on a grander scale. Muller seemed to understand that earlier than anyone. In one of his last notes, written in fading ink, he said, "War is not the breaking of order. It is what happens when order is a lie." That's the kind of sentence that doesn't come from ideology, it comes from exhaustion, from watching men die for lines on a map that keep moving anyway. What makes his story so powerful isn't the coincidence of the broken compass or the accidental ambush. It's what it reveals about the nature of human control. That no matter how advanced, how organized, how certain we think we are, one random variable can flip the entire narrative. A storm, a cracked lens, a misaligned needle, and suddenly, everything collapses. The map burns, the plans vanish, and all that's left is instinct. And maybe that's what the greatest ambush in World War II really was. Not just a military event, but a philosophical one. A moment that exposed the fragility of every plan, every illusion of control. A moment when the universe reminded humanity that even in a war built on precision and engineering, chance still writes the final chapter. But there's another layer here too, something deeper, almost poetic. Because if you zoom out from the history, from the tanks and uniforms and tactics, Muller's story isn't really about war at all. It's about what happens when the compass you've trusted your whole life fails you. Whether that compass is a belief system, a moral code, or a sense of purpose, it doesn't matter. One day, it stops pointing north. And in that moment, you either break or you learn to walk without it. That's what he did. He stopped chasing north. He stopped pretending the needle knew more than he did. And by doing that, by trusting movement over certainty, he found a kind of freedom most people never do. The kind born not from victory but from surrendering to chaos without losing yourself in it. When his journals finally reached a museum decades later, the curator described the compass as still trembling. Even after all those years, its needle never rested. It's almost as if the metal itself remembered what Muller learned the hard way, that direction is never fixed, and certainty is never safe. And that's the truth buried beneath the legend of the broken compass. The greatest ambush in World War II wasn't the Soviets turning on themselves. It was fate ambushing humanity's arrogance, reminding us that the smallest crack can unravel the grandest design, that one man's error can echo louder than any general's command. So maybe Muller wasn't lost at all. Maybe he was the only one who ever truly knew where he was going.